Good morning, everyone. It is a great pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar and to open the second session of our Inclusion Talks webinar series. I am João Costa, Director of EASNIE, the European Agency for Special Needs and Inclusive Education. Following the strong engagement in our first webinar last month, we are very pleased to continue this series, which forms part of EASNIE's 30th anniversary activities. Inclusion Talks reflects our ongoing commitment to creating spaces for dialogue, shared learning, and reflection on inclusive education across Europe and beyond. For those of you who may be joining us for the first time, EASNIE works with ministries of education across Europe and partner countries to support the development of inclusive education systems. Our work brings together policy, research, and practice, offering evidence and practical tools that help turn inclusive education principles into everyday reality. Everything you do is guided by a simple but strong conviction that all learners at any stage of life are entitled to inclusive, equitable, and high-quality education. Before we begin, just a few practical points. The webinar is being recorded and the recording will be shared on EASNIE's YouTube channel. If you experience any technical issues, please contact my colleagues via the Q&A function in your screen. And more interestingly, if you have questions during the session for our speakers, please type them into the Q&A box. We will address at the end as many questions as possible during the discussion period of this webinar. Today's webinar focuses on teacher preparedness for inclusive education, a topic that has been central to EASNIE's work for many years. EASNIE approaches teacher preparedness not as an individual issue, but as a system-level responsibility, shaped by policy, teacher education, professional learning, leadership, and working conditions. This understanding underpins key EASNIE outputs, such as the profile of inclusive teachers and the profile for inclusive teacher professional learning that you can consult and see in our website. These outputs frame preparedness around shared values, professional competence, and collective responsibility. Today, we are delighted to be joined by two guests who bring complementary perspectives on teacher preparedness for inclusive education. We are joined by Ekaterina Efimenko, Coordinator for Democracy, Equality and Environment at the European Trade Union Committee for Education, ETUCE, who brings a strong European social partner perspective on inclusion, the teaching profession and working conditions. Above all, Ekaterina brings the voice of teachers who are experiencing all the challenges and making inclusion happen in the classrooms all around Europe. We are also joined by Professor Lani Florian, Professor Emerita at the University of Edinburgh, internationally recognized for her work on inclusive pedagogy and teacher education. Together, they will help us explore teacher preparedness from both research-informed and policy and practice-oriented perspectives. The topic, as I mentioned, the topic of teacher preparedness has been a long area of work for EASNIE. And I would like to, again, highlight two or three major outputs. The teacher education for inclusion, preparing all teachers via initial teacher education, is a flagship work explicitly about how all teachers are prepared to be inclusive. And it produced the profile of inclusive teachers as a key output that, again, you can visit and read on our website. This web area on the profile of inclusive teachers describes the project's purpose as identifying the essential competencies for everyone entering teaching and positioning inclusive education as the responsibility of all teachers. Another piece of work is the teacher professional learning for inclusion, career-long preparedness. This work is explicitly framed around identifying the policy elements needed to prepare all teachers to include all learners across initial teacher education, induction, continuing professional development, and teachers educators learning. More recently, in work developed together with Finland and Ireland under the technical instruments of the European Commission, teacher professional learning in the two systems has been extensively discussed in one of the outputs of our outputs, teacher professional learning in Finland and Ireland, a findings report. This report on teacher professional learning in the two countries covers the full continuum, initial teacher education through to professional development, including induction and in-school learning opportunities. We are very much aware that inclusion is not just a set of principles, it is about practices, it is about supporting the teachers for their inclusive journey in everyday class, in everyday schools. So, because this is about teachers, our first speaker is the teacher, Ekaterina Efimenko, as I mentioned, coordinator for democracy, equality and environment at the European Trade Union Committee for Education, ETUCE. Ekaterina brings extensive experience working on inclusive education, the teaching profession, democracy and citizenship education, human rights and environmental sustainability, representing the perspective of education trade unions at European level. She coordinates the work of ETUCE's Standing Committee for Equality, Equality Expert Group and Status of Women Committee, and leads several European-funded projects on inclusion, democratic citizenship and sustainability in education, including joint initiatives between education employers and trade unions. We are very glad to welcome you, Ekaterina, and look forward to your contribution to today's discussion. The floor is yours. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good morning, and thank you, João. Thank you for inviting me to this webinar to contribute with our perspective on inclusive education, but also congratulations on the impressive work of 30 years on enhancing the inclusive education. And we have worked with you a lot during this 30 years as well, using your data, your tools, and so this is really good. And I also would like to thank you for making teachers' preparedness a topic for the already second webinar, which sends a strong message about what is the key element and who are the persons and the agents of change in inclusive education. So I will start from sharing just a few words about European Trade Union Committee for Education. For those who do not know about us, we are the social partners at the European level and the federation of 120 education trade unions in 48 countries. We represent members not only in the European Union, but also all over Europe and even in the other regions around Europe. We're also defenders of the interests of teachers and other education personnel towards the European Commission and other European institutions. We represent all levels of education, starting from early childhood education and going through the general education and vocational education, but also higher education and research. And we are also the regional structure of Education International, which is the international trade union representative at the international level. And also we are a confederation within the European Trade Union Federation. For us, equality, diversity, and inclusion is one of the key priorities in work. And just to share with you that we have several big policies, comprehensive policies, such as, for example, ETUCE Action Plan on Equality, Diversity, and Inclusion, where we focus on all the topics that are covered by inclusive education, looking also at how we can celebrate the diversity no matter what your background is in education, but also such important elements as democratic citizenship and transmission of fundamental values. And of course, we focus on specific topics such as inclusion of migrants and refugees or inclusion of gender equality. We have a special action plan on gender equality, as the teaching profession is often rather a feminized profession. And we also have a database, which I invite all participants to check after the webinar, of various good practices of how education trade unions can contribute to enhancing inclusive education and various elements of it. But now, if we go into the core of our discussion today, I think it's important to start from the understanding what inclusive education is. João mentioned that it's not just teacher preparedness, it's also a systemic approach. And what we often see that in different countries, there is a different understanding of what inclusive education is. And in some countries, if you say inclusive education, people would think only about persons with special needs and disabilities, while we find it very important that we say that carefully building inclusive learning environment is the basis of education, meeting the needs and interests of all learners and education personnel, regardless of their background. And we also put importance on the key elements and conditions for the implementation of inclusive education. Before we go to teachers and how they are prepared, it's important to highlight that, for example, the necessary policy frameworks and mechanisms should be in place to support the inclusive implementation of inclusive education. These policies should be accompanied by sufficient resources and public funding. It's very important to have a strong message that investing in education is investing in people. And also having a clear vision of inclusive education, which is embedded in those policy frameworks. And this vision should include a sound and shared understanding of the concept of inclusion by all stakeholders, including policy and decision makers. And here you see, of course, on this slide, the initial education and continuous professional development for all education professionals. And we're talking here not only about teachers, but also school leaders, education support personnel, also going into the higher education, academics and researchers. That it is very important that this understanding of inclusive education and vision is shared by everyone. There are also other important elements of inclusive education from our perspective, such as, for example, safe and healthy working and learning environments that are free from harassment and bullying, including the cyberbullying. And we see that for our members, for education personnel around Europe, there is a strong need for the training in this area. And actually, I must say that in the past few years, this became even more important topic due to increase of violence in education institutions. But there are also important elements of adequate recruitment and retention policies for teachers and other education personnel that would reflect the diversity in the education sector in society. We know very well that, unfortunately, the teaching profession is not as diverse as the student body. And therefore, students with various backgrounds do not find themselves represented in the teaching profession. They also often lack the role models because the teaching profession is not something that they see could be attractive to people with their background. Another important elements are the adequate governance models, also adequate assessment and monitoring systems. We often see that national tests still focus too much on the performance, attainment, rather than promoting learning for everyone. And of course, and I will go more into that later on, is the sufficient time within the working hours for teachers, trainings, and other education personnel to implement an inclusive education approach. If we want to implement truly inclusive education, we need time for that, and we need space within the working hours. Now, to the question that was asked for this webinar is, are education personnel prepared for inclusive education? I will be sharing throughout this presentation some data that we have collected through our projects on inclusive education. We had several projects in the last 5 years, some focusing on specific issues such as inclusion of migrants and refugees, or inclusion of persons with special needs and disabilities, but also we had a project that looked at inclusive education overall. So why is it needed? Why is it important that teachers are prepared for inclusive education? It is because we see that there are more and more increasing expectations on teachers and other education personnel to perform tasks that go beyond their core job description. If you look at the job description when teachers are being hired, it does not mention such issues as peer evaluation or development of action plans for inclusive education. And often administration-related tasks are also not mentioned there. And we see from European policies that there are more and more demands, such as learning about sustainability. Every teacher has to integrate it no matter what is the subject, or democratic citizenship education, teaching students about the dialogue, about how to find compromises, etc. This is something that rises more and more and piles up on each other, meaning that inclusive education becomes more and more complex. But we also see such issues in the society as increasing social and cultural diversity or rising inequalities. And this is something that goes beyond the education institution, and teachers, they do not operate in silos. Therefore, all these issues have an impact on how education personnel should be prepared. Another big topic right now is the rapid technological changes, digitalization in education. Many countries are talking about introducing artificial intelligence in education, and this is something that is really needs to be taught, needs to be discussed with the teachers, and we need to see how this can be integrated into preparedness of teachers. So we also see that on some specific topics, like, for example, special educational needs, this is the data from 2025 in TALIS, we see that 1 in 4 teachers reports a high level of need for professional development in teaching students with special needs, while adapting teaching to students' diverse learning needs is a source of stress for more than 1/3 of teachers. This is about specifically special educational needs. The integration of migrant students, we also see that teachers report lack of relevant initial teacher education that would address the inclusion of migrants and refugees, as well as the lack of relevant continuous professional development, and other issues such as, for example, language barriers in interaction with students, or educational gaps that are not addressed as a result of displacement. Engagement with parents is also something that is going beyond the job description, but actually very important and needs to be also trained on. I would like to share with you what topics, according to our members, should be included in public training of teachers. And this goes for both initial education of teachers and continuous professional development. All of these topics were phrased mostly of how to, because there is a lot of theory that is there, and there is a lot of resources provided on inclusive education, but many of them are rather the theoretical approaches, while the practical tools, like João mentioned, are often lacking. And what we see is there is a big ask for including such topics as how to implement participatory and collaborative learning approaches with the view to strengthen the joint work of learners from diverse backgrounds. From school leaders, but also from teachers, a big ask was how to implement a whole school approach for inclusive education. One of the rising issues now as well, due to socio-political situation and challenges in many countries, is how to provide support on how to manage difficult situations, so-called difficult situation in the classroom. It could be a disrupted behavior, bullying, but also nowadays we see quite a big impact of social media, for example, or various anti-democratic discourses coming from social media to students and causing conflicts and causing the polarization among students, which needs to be addressed by teachers, but teachers often feel that they're not prepared and not equipped to deal with such issues, like hate speech or fake news, for example, as well. How to recognize and better understand hidden biases and stereotypes in curricula, education, and research materials. We all know that we try to make sure that curricula are not including any stereotypes, but there are sometimes certain hidden biases, and it is a progress so to remove them from curricula, but it is often in other materials as well that teachers might use, that they need to be able to recognize and to understand these biases and to remove them from the teaching materials. A big ask is, of course, how to use the ICT tools, artificial intelligence I'm going to add here, but also media to foster the inclusion in education. How to create safe and healthy working environments and learning environments that are free from harassment and bullying. One of the biggest asks is how to appropriately manage an increasing workload. We just mentioned the various demands and asks from teachers that are adding on the workload. So how to make sure that you manage that workload and still remain the agent of change for inclusive education. And of course, how to teach in multicultural settings and manage and encourage intercultural dialogue is also a big issue that we see as more and more the schools are becoming very multicultural. And as I mentioned, the issues also of language barriers coming here in place. What we see from our members from the data is that the topics most addressed and most needed in training, that needs to be most addressed in training, in their opinion, is doing the inclusive education for students with special needs, but also looking at more comprehensive models and approaches of learning to support inclusive education as a whole. We also see that refugees and migrant learners are on the top of the priorities there, and pedagogies to address the needs of the wide diversity of all learners is also really needed. Now, what I already mentioned, and this is something that we saw in our surveys, is that 90% of respondents said that there is an urgent action needed on the training of education personnel in relation to appropriately manage the increased workload. And this graph shows you, this is from Eurydice, on teachers in Europe. It shows you the percentage of teachers experiencing stress due to a high workload. And we can't emphasize enough the point that sufficient time is key for implementing inclusive education, that it should be done within working hours, including preparation, consulting with colleagues and professionals, working with parents, etc., as it has a strong impact also on the well-being of teachers. And if the teachers' well-being is not taken care of, then the inclusive education would not work. Of course, now we should talk about continuous professional development and also initial professional development, but more specifically, the gaps that we see in continuous professional development on inclusive education is that typically it focuses on the subject-specific teaching methods and pedagogy, while inclusive education is often offered as separate courses that are not even always mandatory. And we see that some European education systems, they support continuous professional development on learners' well-being, inclusive environments, and family-school relationships, while other countries would focus more on specific backgrounds of learners, such as, for example, migrant learners in Belgium, Spain, Malta, Sweden, while others would focus on specific issues that are not necessarily linked to one or the other background, like migrant background. They would rather address stress and trauma in young people in general, like in Ireland, France, Poland, and Switzerland. However, we see that gaps remain, particularly in addressing the holistic needs of students. And these gaps are often being filled in by other actors, such as, for example, in Portugal, the Portuguese Association of Teachers for Intercultural Education offers professional training for teachers to enhance their ability to teach in multicultural and multilingual settings. And often these gaps are also filled in by education trade unions, such as one of our members in Poland. Polish Teacher Union supports education systems and both Ukrainian and Polish teachers. It was also linked to the crisis that happened after the war started in Ukraine. And such initiatives like free online professional development, webinars for school administrators on employing and managing intercultural assistance, or courses on Polish as a foreign language, providing also counseling resources, etc. It was all organized by the Education Trade Union in Poland. What would be our recommendations for professional development of education personnel if we want to have an ideal situation for implementation of inclusive education? It is crucial that strengthening professional development is providing teachers with values, knowledge, and skills to enable every child to succeed. It is really essential if we want teachers to be change agents. It should be relevant to teachers' needs. It should cover multiple aspects of inclusive teaching for all learners. And it should not be a one-time stand offer. It should also include a follow-up support to help teachers integrate new skills into classroom practices. It is also very important, of course, the funding of these practices, or the funding of provision of professional development. It should be both in inclusive and in special education. It should be ensured that provisions for continuous professional development are included in collective agreements, that they are funded sufficiently, and that continuous professional development is provided during the working time, hence the whole discussion about the workload. Inclusive approaches should also be embedded as a core component of teacher education rather than treated as a specialist topic or modules focused on special education or particular backgrounds. I here share with you some quotes from our recent joint project with the employers on inclusion of special needs, where we saw that often there is not sufficient awareness in the higher education stakeholders of the importance of inclusion and how the professional development can contribute to inclusion due to various structural problems, such as, for example, bureaucratic obstacles or time constraints, etc. And we also see that even in countries like Ireland, where teachers do have access to continuous professional development on inclusive education, there is still a difficulty of getting teachers released from school to attend due to supply problems. We know that teacher shortage is a big issue for European countries nowadays. And going to my conclusions, I would like to actually highlight that it is not just the professional development that is crucial for teacher preparedness to become agents of change in inclusive education. It has to be a whole system, which means that teachers, trainers, academics, and other education personnel, they need not only professional development, but also support of specialized assistants, smaller classes, professional support and materials, as well as assistive technologies. The government and education authorities should be held responsible for implementing inclusive education, meaning provision of sustainable public funding, real and efficient social dialogue. As social partners in education, I cannot highlight this more, that nothing about teachers should be done without them. Safe and healthy learning environments and working environments, and more diversity among education personnel, what I started from talking about. And so inclusive education should not be left to a goodwill of individuals, but it requires a systemic approach. We know that there are many teachers that are burning for their mission and for their job, and they do include on their free time, they develop inclusive education approaches, etc. But it should not be on the goodwill of individuals. It should be systemic. It should be an education that is built on the concept of support-based inclusion and whole institution approach. There needs to be an adequate assessment of students' learning needs, as well as the use of students' diverse background to benefit their learning. They should not be, and this is a bigger philosophical discussion, that diversity should not be seen as an obstacle, but rather as an advantage. And this is an approach that that inclusive education should be based on. And other important elements would also include the support for professional autonomy and discretion of education professionals, enabling them to determine, because they are the professionals who work with students, they are the ones who should determine the most effective approaches to support students with various backgrounds. And of course, investing in enhancing the attractiveness of the teaching profession, so we do not have an issue of the supply in the teaching profession, are also crucial. And I will finish my presentation with the inspiring quote from one of the teachers from our member in Israel, which shows how the teaching job is actually so much bigger than any other job. It actually becomes a life for those who are doing it. She says, I'm a mother of 5 and another 35. She's a director of the kindergarten. I suffer from a rhythm and dance disorder. The disorder manifests itself in a difficulty to concentrate on a contemporary task and taking over of the kindergarten life on my home life. In the morning, when I get up, I brush my teeth and I review how many bottles of shampoo were spilled on the floor in yesterday's showers in the kindergarten, and how do I turn them into planters and flower pots in the kindergarten garden. When I hang laundry, I reflect on the rabbit's cage. They have rabbits in the kindergarten, and tell myself to remember to buy them alfalfa again. When I go shopping for my house, I also buy flour for a baking day tomorrow at the kindergarten and some of the products that children would enjoy. In a Zumba dancing class, something I do for myself, I think of dancing with the handkerchiefs and drums with the children. And when I decide to make time for myself at the beach, I collect shells for the creation hour I plan. When I went to the carpenter to order the closet, I returned with bags of wood cuts to the carpentry shop activity center. When I went to throw away the garbage, I came back with a mirror I found that would fit in the doll's corner. I went with my own children to the neighborhood playground. I wanted to be an investing mom, and I found myself at a parent-teacher meeting on the garden's bench explaining gross motor skills. And at night, when I went to bed, I remembered that I wanted to recommend occupational therapy to Ariel, and I should talk to his mother tomorrow. Let it be late. I write, arrange, teach, print, take pictures, program, manage, advise, hold, bake, hang, cut, paste, promote, recommend, and I think. But most of all, I love. And on that, I will finish my presentation. Thank you very much. You can always contact me at the address provided in the presentation.
Thank you very much, Ekaterina. Great closure for your presentation with the voice of this teacher. As you mentioned, it is really our goal to work for the teachers, but work with the teachers more and more. And so I see this as the continuation of a relationship that I want to prolong. Our goal with our 30th anniversary celebrations is not only to celebrate the past, but look at the future and explore future collaborations. Thank you for bringing so many sharp topics that I think are really big help for all the policymakers that are attending this webinar. Let me now turn to our second speaker, and it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Lani Florian. She is Bell Chair of Education Emerita at the University of Edinburgh and is widely known for her research on inclusive pedagogy and teacher education for inclusive education. Her work has been particularly influential in supporting educators and systems to rethink how teachers are prepared to teach all learners, and in ensuring that research evidence is not only theoretical, but applied in schools and embedded in teacher education programs at undergraduate and postgraduate level around the world. Lani, it is a great pleasure to count on you with us today, as we have been counting on you in the work with EASNIE for so many years. The floor is yours.
Thank you, João. It's a pleasure to be here. And I would like to just say to people who don't know me, I trained as a teacher of children with special educational needs. So that is the starting basis upon which my career has been built. I also, in addition to becoming a researcher over time, have really focused on teacher education and teacher preparation. So a lot of what I want to say today is going to come from the perspective of a teacher and a teacher educator. And I would like to build on Ekaterina's really excellent presentation. It was so comprehensive, and it also covered so much territory. So what I think I'd like to do today is to say a few words about why the framework that she identified for us is so useful, but also so complex and presents so many challenges for practitioners. I'm going to talk a little bit about the policy, legacy, and context for the situation that we find ourselves in today. And I would like to also spend a few minutes talking about how thinking differently opens up new possibilities for practice. You know, I'd like to focus a little bit on the underpinning theory in the framework for developing curricula for teacher educators has come from. And I'm going to argue that we need the new thinking because we have to streamline the way in which we prepare teachers so that we can cover the range of topics that we just heard about in the previous presentation, some of which are very new to all of us. And I'm going to give some examples from practice, from what we've learned so far, and end with just a couple of key issues for the future. So I want to start by just pointing out that the inclusive education, developed out of special needs education initially. And we are in a different place now than we were 30 years ago, but the legacy of where the idea originated from still reverberates to quite a large extent in the practices that we are dealing with today. So the International Classification of Education defines special needs education as that which is designed to facilitate learning by individuals who, for a wide variety of reasons, require additional support and adaptive pedagogical methods in order to participate and meet learning objectives in an education program. Now, this key word in this definition is additional. Is what is it that is additional that's required to meet special or additional support needs. And that is a really important question. And in our legacy, in terms of developing practice in special needs education, we have focused on individual needs. We have focused on different types of learning difficulties, and then what it is that we can do to mediate those difficulties so that children can learn. And that has been a time-honored practice. It has been one that has given us a lot of knowledge about teaching diverse groups of learners, particularly when children are experiencing difficulties, but it is focused on individual instruction to such a large extent that we kind of lose the big picture about the context within which learning is a social act and children are learning together and interacting with each other. It also reinforces the idea of a pedagogical, a categorical approach that reinforces the fact that there are differences between learners, and it calls attention to those differences. And so, the pedagogy that we have is really silent about how children learn within a community of learners. And that is what we have inherited in terms of where we are today. And all of this makes a lot of sense if we think about it in terms of what others have, and myself, have called bell curve thinking about education. So the idea of special needs education makes a lot of sense when we think about the structure of schooling in many, many places, most places, where the idea is we have a system that provides the greatest good for the greatest number of children. It's a very utilitarian and useful way of organizing provision. And the idea is that most children learn in similar kinds of ways. And so what we do for most children will be the norm. And then we do something additional. So we're back to that word that defines special needs education. We do something additional or different for those some who are on the tail ends of the distribution. And that is our way of including all. That is our historical legacy. The problem is that the naturalization of the bell curve as a structural feature of schooling is inherently unjust because it perpetuates the inevitability of failure. In order to, when you see that bell curve structure, you by definition, up to 50% of learners have to be below average. And so, we have a structural problem here, but that is so embedded and naturalized within education systems, it's very, very difficult for us to see that. And so the work of inclusive education occurs within that bell structure, a bell curve structure of schooling, and that is part of what makes the work so difficult. But it also, inclusive education emerged as an alternative to the problems that were identified with special needs education. There were some critiques quite a few years ago now, but that really, when people became aware of this injustice, they started to say, what replaces this? What can we do differently? So inclusive education emerged initially as an alternative to special needs education as the process of participation in mainstream education and the reduction of exclusion from mainstream education. But the practices that were associated with that process were wide-ranging. So we are talking about inclusive education now, and that it's a process for increasing participation and reducing exclusion. But the actual practices that are associated with that, at least initially, were rooted in special needs thinking about individual differences. And the idea was to scale up these practices. And that became a problem because it put a burden on already, it highlighted the differences between how teachers in special needs education were working and how they were prepared, and also relative and against those in mainstream education. And so this idea of collaboration and how we work together came to the fore, and there was a question around, can we scale up these practices? How do we do it? What are the training needs, etc.? Inclusive pedagogy is something that was developed as a specific way of thinking and working about differences between children that addresses some of those problems and practices where people felt like, is this special ed scaled up? Who does it? Who's responsible? It was a way of shifting the thinking about our practice, but also doing so in a way that turned the definition of special needs education on its head and said, instead of thinking about individual differences between learners, let's think about extending what's ordinarily available for some learners, for most learners, to a wider diversity of children. And so when we, sorry about this, next slide, please. When we talk about inclusive education, our legacy is that it's the idea of all children being educated together in a unified education system, originally concerned with children with disabilities, but now a broad concept that encompasses anyone who might be excluded from or have limited access to the education system within the country. And Ekaterina, did a good job of reminding us about, how wide and diverse that group is. And within Europe, what we see, we talk about those in vulnerable situations. Persons with disabilities are almost always in vulnerable situations, but there are other marginalized groups that, require a greater or lesser degree of attention within national education systems because of the demographics of schooling. So this, again, is a very well-known list, but it covers, the groups of children and learners who might be in those vulnerable situations. So we now move from this wider understanding of inclusive education to this call from the Council of the European Union that all statutory teacher education programs should embed inclusion, equity, and diversity and understanding underachievement, disengagement, and addressing well-being, mental health, and bullying. Again, Ekaterina did a good job of outlining those things as really important topics within which teacher education has to develop some means and ways of providing support and training to teachers so that they have those competencies when they go into schools. We see that we are asking, how do we prepare teachers to respond to individual differences between learner and learner groups? But we're doing this within a form of provision that is structured in ways that perpetuates failure. This is why the work is so difficult for us. And yet at the same time we're working within this structure, we are trying to promote common values, active citizenship, transmit a sense of belonging, and respond to diverse needs within a rights-based equitable framework. That's usually where people start when they do these kinds of presentations. And what I'm asking us to do is step back a little bit and say, what is trying to unpack some of the complexity around the pressures and the challenges that we are facing in a way to help open up some spaces so that we can think about how we can change the way that we do our work. We're dealing with more diverse groups than ever before, but teachers often do not feel adequately prepared for the job, and we got excellent data from Ekaterina about that. So we know where we are. We've got changing demographics of schooling, which is the key issue here. But also within our research communities, we have a much deeper understanding of the interrelated nature of race, gender, class, ability, ethnicity, all of the things that contribute to our understanding and our ideas about what comprises, or what we're talking about when we talk about vulnerable learners. These categorical approaches ignore the fact that someone may have a disability, but also, that there may be poverty may also be a factor, or migration status may also be a factor. There are multiple overlapping identities. I'll say more about that in a minute. And there are calls for the reform of teacher education because teachers have continuously reported that they are not adequately prepared to do this job. So one of the things that I've been asking in my work is, what have we done in the past to prepare teachers for to work with diverse groups of learners, and why are we still facing this difficulty? Because there is a long history of efforts to address this problem, and it's not as if we haven't been doing anything over a long period of time. But part of what we have been doing is there are two basic models. One is an add-on model. We take our mainstream, or we go into teacher education problems, and we add content, we add information about the topics that Ekaterina outlined for us. The other is that we try to infuse the information about that content into an already existing curriculum. So we've got the take an extra course, have extra content, guest lectures, etc., time-honored ways of providing additional information, or we say, we'll take this information and we'll put it into what we're currently doing, and that way we've covered everything. But despite many, many years of efforts to do that, in many, many countries, especially in the Northern Hemisphere, we do not see a big return on that investment. And so the question becomes, what's an alternative? Like, what do we do next? I want to just say a few words about the work that informs the argument that I'm going to make for the new way of thinking about how to prepare teachers. With myself and my colleagues and many other people have done work on what we call studying teachers' craft knowledge, which is the knowledge that emerges from the practices of teachers. So this, again, it turns the theory-practice gap upside down and says, instead of asking why teachers don't use theory, let's develop our theory from getting a better understanding of how teachers do their work. And that there's the research for that has led to the theorizing that we do around inclusive pedagogy, and which is described on the next slide, and this is what was learned from the studies of teaching practice. Teachers who were good, they worked within the bell curve structure of schooling, but they were also really good at including diverse groups of learners in their classrooms. This is what we learned from them, that differences are to be expected. So a difference, we started to theorize the idea of difference as ordinary. Difference is the norm. It's not the exception to the rule. That also, they rejected bell curve thinking. They did not see themselves as deficient. They did not see themselves as unprepared. They saw themselves as capable. They started from the point of view that all children can learn. So they rejected this idea of most and some. They thought about everybody. And they instead of seeing difficulties as problems within children, they saw them as challenges for teachers. But it's also the case that that's a big ask. And so we have to reconceptualize differences between learners as opportunities for teaching. And associated with that is the notion that collaboration is essential, because there is such a thing as specialist knowledge. But it's how we integrate that into teachers' understanding of what it is and how they use it and how they draw upon it to be more inclusive in their practice in mainstream classrooms. So if we think about difference as an ordinary aspect of human development, we stop thinking about people in terms of the silos of a migrant, a disability, indigenous people, and we start understanding that each and every one of us is a unique individual, and that what creates individual differences between us is the multiple overlapping characteristics or identities, whatever it is you want to call it, that produce those individuals. And you see in the next slide that these are biometric, they're social, they're biographical. And the extent to which these overlap characterize how I am different from you, or you are different from the person sitting next to you. And this takes that notion of identifying a specific difficulty, and you see them in the slide: ethnicity, disability, gender, some of the ways in which we silo our knowledge about differences and say, actually, these are multiple overlapping differences, and we need to think differently about them. So if we go to the next slide, I'm also suggesting that if that is the case, then diversity is the new norm, then we need new thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. We have to extend this to that as well. And I'd like to suggest, it's just a suggestion, that we, again, in the 21st century, need a little bit of fresh thinking about those words, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I'm starting to think about them in terms of dignity, the recognition of the inherent worth of each and every person, empathy, the ability to share someone else's feelings or experiences in imagining what it would be like to be in that person's situation, and integrity, which is adherence to a way of working in the development of practice that's based on interdependence between people instead of individual differences. And I'd love to test these ideas or get some feedback in our Q&A about whether those align, and help us deepen our appreciation of those concepts of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So if we take that as a starting basis, and we think that inclusive practice is about extending what is ordinarily available, then we focus on the what and how of learning for everyone together, and we avoid the stigma of marking some children as different. This is foundational to teacher preparation. But how do we do that in an already crammed and very short period of time to prepare teachers to do all of these things that I'm talking about and that Ekaterina has talked about? And in streamlining our thinking, I would like to suggest when we talk about practitioners as capable, instead of saying there are two bodies of knowledge, when we look within those bodies of knowledge, you see on the chart that's up here now, the key assumptions about inclusive pedagogy on the left-hand side of the table. But these are set against the science of learning, which comes straight out of mainstream education, and the idea of how teachers should be prepared and to think about approaching teaching and learning as newly qualified teachers. And this is, here we're talking about variability in human development is the norm. Learning is a social and emotional act. Development is malleable. What schools do matter. Human relationships are key. When you really look at the key messages that are coming out of research on how we approach teacher education, there is a lot of alignment between that and how we think about accommodating differences and extending what is ordinarily available. So just to sum up, and move on, I want to now give you some examples of how this idea of streamlining and reforming our mainstream teacher education programs so that mainstream classroom teachers are equipped with the competencies and the knowledge and skills to feel more comfortable about working with a wide, diverse group of learners, was implemented in a reform project. First of all, in Scotland, the Scottish government, and this was between 2006 and 2010, funded a research project that was aimed to develop these new approaches so that teachers would have that greater appreciation, and also develop strategies that they could use, practical strategies to support children who are experiencing difficulties when they encountered them. And the Inclusive Practice Project embedded the principles of inclusive pedagogy and in a way that aligned them with the basic understanding of learning that was being promoted within mainstream teacher education programs. And in the process of doing that, and we tried not to add on or infuse, but to take that curriculum right from the start and work from conceptualizations that came from mainstream to reform and revise the content of the program. And we found that that was quite a good way to embed the knowledge. And then also we had to ask, well, if we can do this in one university, because we had one university as a site, how do we work with our colleagues in the other universities, in this case within Scotland, to ensure that all teachers in programs that were distinctive from the one that we were working in were prepared. And so we also worked with mainstream and special needs colleagues to develop a set of questions that we could ask ourselves about the content of our teacher education programs that aligned with the General Teaching Council Scotland teacher competencies that were the outcomes of our teacher education programs in ways that ensured that we had embedded those practices and those ideas and ways of working and gave teachers the confidence to work with more diverse groups in the first instance. And we've got this national framework for inclusion, but the important thing I want to say about this here is that this has been revised every time the General Teaching Council revises its competencies. The inclusion group revises its framework, so that this is a living document. I think it's now in its third or fourth edition, but it sits alongside what is happening in teacher education more broadly. And so it's helping to just keep us thinking about this as one thing instead of two things that we're trying to integrate, or layering new more information on very already overloaded teacher education programs. João and Ekaterina, I think both noted a European agency has been doing a lot of work in this area over the last 20 years, I think it is now, or 15 anyway. And these are just the covers from the two projects that João mentioned, because it is flagship work, and the tools that are being developed by the agency are really, really useful for working with our colleagues in mainstream and looking at these kinds of ideas as for everyone, not just for retraining special needs or, specialists with migrant children, etc. There are also, now I'm just going to finish up by just pointing out a couple of other things that are part of the literature on teacher education, where there are very good examples of practice from other countries and from other researchers who are thinking and sharing examples of their work. So there is a book from Springer that came out in 2017. There are also in 2020 a special issue of the European Journal of Teacher Education. And I will now just say in summary that, and I would do this as a researcher, we do need further research to explore how the graduates of these programs enact the practices in the different contexts of their workplace. That is really missing from the literature. And we need to continue the research that makes teachers' tacit knowledge, their craft knowledge, more visible. And we need to theorize from that. And we need an overarching framework that maps the landscape for continuous professional development. We have some good tools, but there's a lot more work to do around filling in the spaces of what those contours look like and how these pieces, fit together or are woven together into a coherent whole. So I'm going to stop there, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lani, for your really rich presentation, and the complementarity between your presentation and Ekaterina's is amazing, because the way you put it, that we need to make the teacher practices more visible in the research is really a way forward in supporting the teachers. We are a bit behind schedule, but I would not want to give the opportunity for our participants to pose some questions to see some answers. There are several questions. I will try to group them in according to the main topics, and then I will give you the floor again in the same order of presentations for very brief hints and suggestions for these questions. We have a group of questions that deal with what teachers experience and the difficulties, sometimes with behavioral problems, the kind of support that teachers need, and relating this with the big topic that Ekaterina mentioned of teacher shortage. And so it is about expectations, it is about support, and if you have any reflections on this, it would be important also, and this is a question maybe more for Ekaterina, a bit of a provocative question, which is, but a very nice one. It's trade unions are obviously the protectors of teachers' rights, and now I add, because they protect teachers, they will protect students, because the more the teachers are protected, the more the learners are protected. But sometimes we see some speech saying a narrative that it is the students from more vulnerable backgrounds that make teachers' life hard and push teachers out of the profession. So the question is, what can be the role of teacher unions to counter this narrative and to support the teachers and not blame the most vulnerable learners? And then finally, a question more to Lani, which is about curriculum, how to make the curriculum more inclusive, and when we are talking about actual change of pedagogy or other methods to increase inclusion in education, how can we make it, and how can this question that just appeared, how can we access teachers' tacit knowledge and practices in inclusive practices? So I'll start with you, Ekaterina, asking you to be brief, although these questions would give us another hour at least to discuss and reflect.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much, João. It is a complex issue. If we talk about trade unions, what they can do is, one, a lot of our members are doing that. They build various courses, professional development courses for their members to integrate this approach, but also to find various ways to implement inclusive education for students with various backgrounds. But also what our members are trying to do is to change the narrative about inclusive education not being a problem, but rather being a future. So trade unions in this way are also being agents of knowledge sharing, agents of changing the mentality of teachers. That I think is a crucial role for our members.
Thank you, Ekaterina. Lani?
Thank you. It's interesting because the expectations on teachers is great, and I'm reflecting now on Ekaterina's slide, which covered the kind of content that needs to be part of teacher education programs, and I mean this like with all due respect. I'm speaking as a teacher educator myself now. Teacher educators, usually come out of practice into the development work. And now we are in such a rapidly changing world. We are preparing teachers to go into the kinds of classrooms that we are completely unfamiliar with in many ways. And that is, we need to be working really, really closely with practitioners. It goes back to my argument about learning from practice, to be able to develop the kind of content that we need to address. It's like building the airplane and flying the airplane at the same time. We need that kind of content to be there, but we also, and this is a huge problem for teacher, not a problem, but it's a constraint on what teacher educators can do, is they are highly regulated by the national governments who tell them what they can do and not do in those teacher education programs and what needs to be covered. And there's far more that needs to be covered in far more depth than there is time for. So it's not just that teachers need time, which they do. They need time to develop their practice in schools, but teacher educators need time to cover the content in their courses. How do we rewrite the curriculum in a way that is relevant for the 21st century, includes the kinds of practices that we know are effective practices, but is also a living kind of process so that it continues to stay current?
Thank you, Lani. And it is really about a multi-stakeholder approach, having everyone's voices, and gladly we'll have other webinars in this series in which collaboration, school leadership, resourcing will be topics. Details of the upcoming webinars are available through EASNIE's website and communication channels, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn. Thank you once again for being with us today. I wish you a very good rest of the day. Thank you, Lani. Thank you, Ekaterina, for all that we've learned with you this morning. Thank you all.